Nyman Metcalfe. She's an adjunct professor of communications law in Tallin University of Technology in Estonia. She's very active globally as a consultant on legal issues of law and technology. And she's an expert in areas such as e-governance, cybersecurity, outer space law, human rights in a digital environment, as well as communications related to legal issues. She has a very extensive background and has worked with governments as well as the European Space Agency. And I'm going to hand it over to you, Katrin, to share more about your background, what you're doing in your daily profession, your view on space and space law, and where we're heading. So a warm welcome to Katrin. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. So I'm very happy to speak with you about the legal side of outer space. I was asked to talk about myself, but I thought it's more interesting to not just talk about myself, but also a bit more generally about the legal side of space and about the developments that have happened with the sort of legal aspects of outer space. And actually, I will try to sort of weave that together, link it with what I've been doing in space or for space, because these two fit together, or like there's this trajectory of what has changed in space law and what has sort of changed with how I've been working with it go quite well together. So that's what I'll try to do. And then afterwards, I understand we have some time if there are any questions as well. So let me just start with kind of rattling off a little bit more about myself. So as was mentioned, I'm adjunct professor of law at Tallinn University of Technology. So I'm working part-time, and I have done through most of my already very long career. I had to say 1 foot in the academic world and 1 in the real world. And what I do in the sort of real world, the non-academic one, is mainly different kind of consultancy projects, mainly for the public sector. And as Karin already mentioned, I work on issues, I should say lately, the last about 15 years, actually mainly on issues related to e-governance and digitalization of society and cybersecurity related to that, which is, as you may or may not know, it's a bit of an Estonian speciality. Because Estonia is actually one of the most digitalized countries in the world. We do pretty much everything online, including voting, for instance. So there's a huge interest in this from all over the world. And it's actually quite nice that it really is the whole world. So it can be developing countries that want to do the same thing as what we did in Estonia some now 30 or more years ago, to kind of jump, to leapfrog, go quickly to an even more modern way of administration. Or it can be rich European countries that are still a bit behind what we do. So this is what I'm working on a lot. What I did a bit more, I still do a bit, but earlier worked more on were projects related to communications law, telecommunications, frequency management, and also to some extent media issues and how the freedom of expression comes in. There are 2 red threads in what I've been working on more or less my whole career, with some exceptions very early when you have to take work, which you can get basically. But the 2 red threads is, one is international. I was interested in international law from when I started studying law. I never thought I would work as a sort of normal lawyer. And then the other red thread is that it's always been related to technology in some way. So law and technology, how those 2 meet. And as for the international aspect, I've lived for at least a couple of years or longer in 6 different countries. And I worked actually in probably more than 50. I haven't really counted them, but I visited more than 100 countries, and mostly it's actually been somehow professionally related. So those are the 2 red threads. And you may be wondering then, how does space come in? Well, to some extent, you will know that, of course, in communications, space does play a role. But the main way in which I have worked with space has been, well, let's say the starting point, and I'll come back in a minute to the main work I do today. But the starting point was that I defended my PhD on the law of outer space in 1999 in Uppsala. I didn't live in Uppsala at the time. I didn't live in Sweden at the time. I actually lived in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where I lived for some years just after the war there, working in a team setting up the regulatory agency for communications. So exactly the kind of work I mentioned. And I did my PhD sort of part-time as an external researcher. So how come then a PhD in the law of outer space? First of all, as I already mentioned, I was always interested in international law. And in that branch of international law, which is called public international law, it used to be called law of nations, which pedagogically was actually a better name, because this shows that what we're talking about here is the legal relation between states, which is in many ways similar to, say, international diplomacy or the international relations. So in some countries, you even, if you do PhDs in international law, you do it in those faculties rather than the law faculty. So it's quite different from national law. It's also quite different from private international law, which is the law about which countries' legislation should apply if there are many countries involved in a case of some sort. Why I'm mentioning this is that's maybe the first explanation of why space law, because lawyers, law students who deal with public international law all come into some contact with space, even if they're not particularly interested in it. And that is because it's a kind of almost, say, testing ground for principles of international law, because it is a really international environment. So if there are going to be any sort of rules and laws and any way of implementing them, it has to be international. So to say, people who study almost whatever topic in international law look a little bit at space law. So that's how I first sort of knew about it and was a bit interested. And also, of course, like many people who work with space, I always liked space. I mean, especially with my grandfather, we were always looking at space and he was explaining things to me about it and so. But then when I started my PhD research, it was not on space. I actually was planning to do something on telecommunications, which was a hot topic in the 1990s when I started, because that was when telecom services had become liberalized, and that changes the legal situation quite a lot when it's no longer just the state providing the services. I started looking at this and actually started then coming a bit more in contact with space law because of those questions of communications that are directly space related, like satellite communications and frequencies for that and so on. And I just found it so interesting. So I talked to my supervisor, and fortunately he was a real space enthusiast, so he let me change the topic. It was a bit surprising to do a PhD in the 1990s on space law, because it was a bit of a low point for space law, not in the sense that it was particularly violated or anything, but just in the sense that not very much was happening. The main rules had already been created, and the big differences, which I shall come back to in a minute, changing what's going on in space had not yet happened. So in that sense, if you would look at how many people globally did research on space law, you would find many fewer such examples in that period than you do now, when there's a real explosion in interest. But anyway, I mean, I was very interested in the topic. The more I was reading about it, the more interested I became. So it was, I mean, I never regretted doing it. And lately, especially about the last 10 years, I've actually been working quite a lot on space-related issues. I'll come to that a little bit later. But in the meantime, then from when I defended the thesis until about 10 years ago, so I kept myself sort of ajour with what was going on. I did some academic articles. And one thing that I've been doing all through ever since I defended the thesis, still do, is there's it's called a moot court competition. It's like for students playing court processes, and in space law. It's quite a famous one called the Manfred Lachs Moot Court, and it's organized every year with some exceptions. And you have then people like myself who are acting as judges, both first judging the written submissions and then sometimes also acting as judges in the sort of oral rounds, which is all done to be very realistic, like a real court case would be. And there are regional rounds in different parts of the world, and then the best ones go on to the sort of global rounds. So this is a way in which one, gets to look at the recent sort of problems or possible things in space, because the cases are written by experts who really try to find things that are realistic and quite complicated and so on. But apart from that, I didn't then have so much space-related work until quite recently. But I will now, as I said, to not just talk about myself, I will now try to share my screen with you if I'm...